So let's just go ahead and get right into part 2 of 5.0 Inside the Empire. Let's talk authentication. So authentication is the process of verifying the identity of a user or device, right? This really is no different than going someplace where they ask to see your state-issued or federal-issued ID, right? You fly, you need an ID. This is a similar process. This, though, is authenticating for logical access to resources, say, on a network, right? So ensures only authorized individuals gain access. It is a crucial step in cybersecurity, obviously, because it does form that initial logical line of defense against unauthorized access. If an attacker, for example, hasn't compromised the user for a username and password, they're going to have a much harder time getting into the network, right? So it does involve various methods that we're going to discuss. So we're going to start that discussion with the authentication mechanisms and their strengths and weaknesses. Now, the one that you're probably most familiar with is something you know, right? And looking at this should be orange because, well, oh, no, it shouldn't. This is not an IC3 topic, but something you know. So a type of authentication factor based on information that the user possesses. So this could be that password we talked about, a passphrase, a PIN for a debit card, or, the answer to a security question, which is never your mother's maiden name, right? That information is readily available. So something you know is what we think of and what was used initially when passwords came to be on networks, okay? So something you have, adding to that, something that you have, a type of authentication factor on a physical object in the user's possession. Now, this can be a security token, and, I'll give you an example. So years ago, Google issued security tokens to all of their employees and literally saw no more attacks as it pertains to authentication attacks, because those hackers might have been able to fool an end user into giving them their username and password, like by saying, hey, we're from IT, we got to change some things, but they didn't have that security token. They didn't have the smart card, or in our case today, mobile devices. So, as a security professional, you should absolutely always demonstrate security principles yourself, right? So in your personal environment, anything financial, bank accounts, etc., I would never trust to just my username and password, even though I use a username that is not my name and I use a very complex password. I'm still not going to trust it. So I use, Google Authenticator or an SMS 6-digit code that's sent to me that changes each time as a means of further securing my accounts. And that practice, that personal practice, should be carried into an organization. I would say any organization today, big or small, should at least have two-factor authentication, in an aspect of, if nothing else, the risk is greatly reduced with an SMS message with a unique 6-digit code each time they log in. Now, granted, some of you hackers are saying, yeah, but what if I clone the phone, blah, blah, blah. Yes, but that's going to be a real targeted or spear phishing attack where that risk would come, to fruition, right? So finally, something you are is a type of authentication based on an inherent physical characteristic. We have unique fingerprints. We have unique facial recognition, unique irises, unique hand geometry, right? Which is a bunch of fingerprints, unique DNA. No authentication yet for that, as far as I know, for regular companies. And then, of course, behavioral biometrics, which we see a lot in testing, where you're asked to type something and they're able to, get a flow and a character per minute and what your common mistakes are as you type, and thus use that pattern as an authentication mechanism. So basically, in providing quality authentication, we implement these mechanisms, right, through factors of authentication. How many times we want a user to authenticate. So, initially is single factor authentication. Again, notice it's in orange. This is something you might see on the ISC2 certification, is the use of just one of the 3 available factors. So remember, it doesn't have to be a username and password. It could just be a smart card that you scan that allows you into a computer. It could, at home, it may just be facial recognition. You don't want to have to put in a password each time. So you've turned on Windows Hello, for example, and facial recognition logs you into your computer. So keep in mind that this is still a standard practice, right? Not a recommended practice, especially for businesses. I wouldn't do it just for my personal account, okay? Something you know, something you have, something you are, as we discussed. So logging into an email account using a password, a username and password. What's the username? Your email address, right? So hackers already have half the pie because your email address is readily available on all of your, well, not on all, but, on social media sites. It's definitely available on the web because you've used it to sign up for something, right? So if the password's compromised, there's no additional layer of security. So we need to do better than that. And we can do better through 2-factor authentication. Now, what's kind of silly here is 2-factor authentication and multi-factor authentication can be similar, as we'll see, okay? So 2-factor authentication is a security process that requires 2 distinct forms of identification. So this could be, again, something you know and something you have. For example, in this picture, and I couldn't help after last week using CrowdStrike as the company name for my little image here created by AI. Remember, all the images here are created by ChatGPT's image creator, DALL-E. So 2-factor authentication, this end user has put in their username, they've put in their password, and now they're using biometrics through fingerprint as a second level of authentication, right? So on your mobile phones, convenience today, most mobile phones use a single authentication, your biometric, right? Which makes it simple to access your bank accounts, financial information, whatever needs to be secured on your phone, because it, again, just asks for your fingerprint. Now, the issue with that is it's still a single-factor authentication, which means if somebody gets a hold of your phone and somehow gets a hold of your fingerprint, they have everything on your phone. So keep that in mind. So second factor simply adds a second factor. That could be, in addition, that doesn't have to be just something you know. It could be something you have and something you are, right? So again, in this case, something he knows, his username and password, and something that he are, his fingerprint. Sorry, I'm a little silly today. I don't know why. I think I'm just tired. Multi-factor authentication is using 2 or more. So see how 2-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication are in some ways similar? But multi-factor authentication goes further. So use 2 or more distinct instances of the 3 factors, right? Something you know, something you have, something you are, for identity verification. So this really can become really inconvenient. However, if we're talking about a high risk, maybe government organization, top secret stuff, 3-factor authentication may be required, right? So the key point here that should be pointed out is, according to CISA, now you'll find different numbers everywhere. I think CISA is a little high in their percentage, but they basically say, multi-factor authentication, 2 or more factors of authentication reduces risk by up to 99%, okay? You'll find 70%, 80%, it's all opinion, right? Because no one really has the facts. So an example would be logging into a corporate network, using a password, a fingerprint scan, and maybe a one-time code. So you've done both of these, and then Google Authenticator gives you a one-time code in addition. So that is the last factor of authentication. And again, it depends on, as we'll see, these rules become policies, right, in administrative controls, and they're based on risk, what it is that we could lose in this process. So additional forms of authentication to be aware of: user provisioning. So, is not really a form, but the way it's implemented is the process involves in creating and maintaining and deactivating user identities on the system, right? So keep in mind, when we onboard an employee, we're going to create a username and password for them. Okay. Usually what happens is we create a username, we give them a temporary password that they are required to change. Why? So no one else, not even people in IT, highly trusted people, know their password. Okay. No one should ever ask for your password. Folks in IT have the ability to see everything. They're never going to ask for your password. All right. So, all of this to gain access to those logical resources. Certificate-based authentication uses digital certificates to authenticate users or devices. So, we see this a lot. For example, certificate-based authentication is SSL, secure socket layer on the internet, right? Where companies have to register and get a SSL certificate that authenticates the company, and of course different levels of certificates based on what data is being transferred, etc. Okay. Finally is passkeys. Now, this is fairly new. It's somewhat complex. I highly recommend, by the way, that you study passkeys, because I think passkeys are gonna surpass, pun intended, a lot of other authentication mechanisms. And the reason is it is convenient. So basically, it's a digital authentication method that uses cryptographic key pairs, that public and private keys that we're used to in encryption, okay, to authenticate users without requiring passwords. So, for example, I just recently, a few months ago, when I heard that Google implemented this, went and suddenly changed a lot of my stuff from the Authenticator app to the convenience of a passkey. Okay, now, so I log into my Gmail someplace. I got to put in my username. I got to put in my password. If I do it from my computer that is trusted by me, thus I've had to log into it, there's a key on my computer that is unique to me that talks to the server who has, the public key and go, oh, the two keys match. This is cool. You've done multi-factor authentication. I'm going to let you in to look at your Gmail. So this is a real good way. It becomes very convenient versus having to grab my phone, look at that extra authentication method, hit my fingerprint, get a code. In the case of Cisco Duo, it is somewhat simplified in that in Duo, I put in my username and password on the website. Duo pops up and says, hey, confirm this is you, something I have, which is the Duo application that happens to be on my phone. So best practices in authentication are ensuring strong password policies, which we've already talked about, implementing multi-factor authentication, so adding that additional layer of protection is huge. Even if you say it reduces risk by 70%, that's a huge amount, right? In that, we can implement biometric authentication if we want. Very important, though, is to review. So, we talked about user provisioning, onboarding a user, creating that password. To expand on that, part of that provisioning is if an employee takes a leave, let's say, goes on FEMLA leave, Family Emergency Medical Act leave, and they're not going to be working during that time, then we want to deactivate their account. We don't want to keep that open and at risk. Then when they come back, we reactivate it. And if they then leave permanently, we deactivate, which we've talked about already, why we don't just delete that user for logging purposes. But part of that process is a regular review, making sure we didn't miss a user that quit. We don't have a user whose password is active and they've been on leave for 6 weeks. So audits are very important in this case and should be done on a regular basis. Depending on the company, that could be every year, that could be 6 months. it could be even 45 days depending on the company. And definitely today, because of the convenience and the high level of security around that public and private key encryption, implementing passkeys when they become available is hugely important. I can't stress that enough, that passkeys are definitely where we're going to go. So this will end part 2. I will see you for part 3. Until then, take it easy and have a great day.